Welcome to Legacy Builders, Strategies for Building Successful Family Enterprises, brought to you by Beacon Family Office at Asante Financial Management Limited. I'm your host, Jorge Gagnon, Senior Wealth Advisor, and on this show, we explore global ideas, concepts, and models that help family enterprises better navigate the complexities of family wealth. Today, we welcome Ruschelle Khanna, owner of Ruschelle Khanna Consulting. With over 20 years of experience, Ruschelle has established herself as a trusted advisor to successful families and high-performing individuals. She's renowned for her empowering approach that helps clients harness their innate healing abilities. Ruschelle's unique blend of therapeutic expertise and wealth consciousness has made her a sought-after guide in overcoming chronic illness challenges and preserving generational wealth. Her work focuses on fostering mindfulness, stewardship, and resolution of ancestral trauma, particularly through masterminds for women in positions of financial influence. My goal is to be the most curious person in today's conversation with Ruschelle, where we explore her innovative work at the intersection of family therapy, health psychology, and wealth management. We'll dive into how uncovering inherited patterns can transform both individuals and family enterprises, challenging conventional wisdom about generational wealth. Ruschelle will explore insights that promise to reshape our understanding of wellness, legacy, and purpose in high net worth families, offering fresh perspectives on building resilient family systems that go beyond traditional financial strategies. Now, let's dive in. Welcome, Ruschelle. We're excited to have you here today to share your wealth of knowledge and experiences with us. Let's dive in, shall we?
Absolutely.
Oh, Ruschelle, imagine you're delivering the commencement speech to the graduating class of 2024, and you have the chance to inspire them with your story. How would you begin your speech to convey the incredible lessons and expertise that you've gained along your career?
Well, Corey, I'd love to share three pivotal moments that have shaped my work. And I hope that they kind of shape the minds of our listeners and give you some things to think about. So the first is a story about inheriting things that we might not want. So I'd like for you to think about your earliest memory. Sometimes we can't remember our earliest memory, but just give it your best guess. So my earliest memory was one that was not fully my own, and I'll explain that. So beginning at age 4, I had reoccurring thoughts. I had these reoccurring kind of visions and fears that something was going to happen to my dad. In fact, that my dad would pass away. And 4 is a little bit young to know anything about death and dying, but that is my earliest memory. And I spent from age 4 to about 12 really worrying about my parents, and I would stay up at night and I would watch them sleep. And I was just very scared, and I didn't know how to articulate this, so no one knew that this was something that I was carrying with me. So as an adult, I learned years later in my work as a therapist that there's a lot of research that says we can actually inherit memories. And that memory that I inherited was actually my mother's. And one signal that we know that it is an inherited trauma memory is that I was the same age when I remembered the memory as my mother was when she had the trauma occur. So my mother was 4 and her father died at home. And so that memory really shaped what I was focused on as a child. So by age 12, I was spending a lot of time introspective. I was interested in what was happening in my inner world. I was interested in death and dying. So I began to meditate regularly at age 12. And that set me up for a life of really wanting to understand transitions and loss. And it set the stage for my career. I really wanted to work with grief and death and dying when I was entering my career as a social worker. So the lesson from that story that I would like for you to take away is that we're more driven by unconscious inherited patterns than we realize. And it really pays to uncover and explore those. The second really pivotal part of my kind of development was early on. I moved from West Virginia, where I grew up and I studied, and I moved to New York to do my graduate work at Columbia University, and as a social worker. And I stepped into the world really early in my career, into the world of ultra high net worth lifestyle and the world of venture capital and hedge funds. So I was a live-in social worker for a family that had experienced sudden wealth, and their adult children were struggling with the sudden wealth. And I was brought in and tasked with putting together an in-home program for one of their adult children who was struggling with a mental health episode related to sudden wealth. And so that was a completely different world for me. I had grown up in southern West Virginia in the coal fields, and so that was a big learning curve. And what I learned from that was that business and wealth transitions, they have lasting consequences that are not just consequences for us, but for our children. And those consequences can have mental, relational, and spiritual impacts, even to the third generation, the fourth generation. And then the last story that I want to share, which was maybe the most recent and most pivotal, is one about switching roles. So March 3rd of 2014, I started having severe and disabling symptoms related to Lyme disease. So at that point, I became completely disabled. And I was no longer able to work. I then became the patient. And in that 4 years, so I got to, I say I got the chance because Lyme really gave me the chance to step away from my work and reflect. Lyme for me was a real learning experience and cathartic experience. Other than the physical pain, I don't really have anything bad to say about my experience of being severely disabled for 4 years. So that time in my life gave me a chance to focus on becoming healthier than I had ever been, becoming more patient than I had ever been, becoming more focused, and also more committed to my clients. So after I recovered from that, I went into the world of private practice, and I really wanted to take all of the lessons that I learned from being severely, severely sick into the families and enterprise that I work with today. And so the lesson that I would want you to take away from that is that our health is our wealth, and that actually those inherited patterns that I talked about at the beginning of this interview, we know that inherited patterns are directly related to chronic illnesses. A lot of my recovering was doing and uncovering the traumas of my ancestors. It wasn't the whole of it. I was taking medicine, I was doing all of these other things. But spiritually, a big component of that was healing the experiences of my ancestors that I had inherited. And for families and enterprise, our family businesses are an entity just like our physical body. And they also carry those stories and those pains, usually unconsciously. And sometimes they come out as traumatic or events that seem to erupt, much like a chronic illness. So what I would love for you to take away from that is that, our inherited patterns are very important for families and enterprise to take a look at. And yeah, so I guess just one other thing that I would want to say about that is that uh, my hope for the listeners on this call is that they can uncover their inherited patterns that are no longer needed. Possibly at one point, those patterns were needed in your family's history, but maybe they're not anymore. And I would want that your listeners can take their families and their businesses to the next level.
Awesome. Wow. What fantastic stories, Ruschelle. I love it. And 4 years of dealing with Lyme disease, that is a lot. And some people can take it very different ways. I know that it's not an easy thing to overcome. So that's a fantastic story. So one of the things that I was thinking about is, as you were telling your first story, is, as you mentioned, that as a 4-year-old, having those thoughts start to show up. And in our everyday language, we don't have a lot of those words to describe feelings. If I think the research shows that there's somewhere around a dozen different words that the average person has to describe feeling. And at 4 years old, you probably didn't even have the average as adults have, which is still a very low number. How do families identify that those things are creeping in? Like if we're talking about that young generation, not even the now generation, how do they realize that that's happening with one of the members of their enterprise?
Sure. So play is the kind of the first entry. You're exactly right. We are when we're 4, we are verbal. We're not pre-verbal, but we're still building out what a story is. And as a we're trying to still learn how to formulate beginning, middle, and end, and what does this mean, and how does it impact me? And we're still kind of driven off of fear. How can I just be comfortable and not afraid? So curiosity and actually asking your children what their experience is. I find a lot of times if I'm working with parents, they just don't think to just, what was that like for you? What did you see there? What was going on? And the answer might not come out in words. It may come out in, let's draw a picture of what you saw there. If my mother had, when my mother saw me staring at them in bed at night, because I'd get up and I'd walk down and I'd be like, are they still okay? If she had paused in the morning and said, what was happening there? What are you doing? What were you thinking there? Let's draw what it was like to be sitting there by yourself, watching mom and dad. So I know that sounds very simple, but sometimes as parents, we just forget to be curious about our kids' inner world.
Right. And I love that drawing as a way to explain something. That's what would seem like a simple strategy, but I think a great way to just have somebody start to draw and bring that out into an image is fantastic. And Ruschelle, as I'm thinking about the idea of inherent memories, and you made the comment about 3 generations in that some of these things can show up and continue for. How do we go about identifying and discovering without thinking about just the guilt side of this, the shame of, wow, what have I done? What have I passed on? Rather than coming from that perspective, but more of, what are those that are present? Because I know every family has them, whether they're positive or negative. How do they how would somebody start and think about those things? And I bring up the positive because I think there's probably some of those inherent memories that are some of that familyness, some of that amazing things in the enterprise that really contributes.
Absolutely. So I will go over kind of the identifiers of the more difficult ones that may not be so surface level, and then we'll move on to the positive. I call these the five liabilities of family businesses, or the five liabilities of trauma. So when we have things like cycles of chaos, cycles of chaos, Aunt Aunt Jane and Uncle Joe can never get along, and this is just the way that it is, and they act just like grandma did, or whatever. These kinds of things where it's like almost normalized chaos. These are indicators, absolutely. So also if we have conflict avoidant, so the next one is conflict avoidant. The conflict avoidant is a little bit harder to identify because they, like the third one, which is the people pleasing. So people pleasers and conflict avoiders, they go under the radar. Now there might be passive aggressive things that come out in conversations, or resentments that pop up later on, betrayals, those sorts of things, but they're not blatant like a constantly angry sister who's in the business or something
Right.
like that. And then we have abandonment. So if there's a pattern of someone abandoning the family, like Aunt Sue abandoned the family, didn't want to work in the business, and now my kid is seeming to act just like that. So abandonment is another one. Let's see, and I'm blanking on the fifth one: cycles of chaos, conflict. Oh, procrastination. So if there are people in your business and your family who just can never seem to get anything done, like maybe they have big ideas, but there's always a lot of overwhelm. So that's the very surface level where there might be something else there. And like I said before, chronic illness is another one that is directly linked. So that is not one of these types of liabilities, not a personality type, but chronic illness and addictions are the other two kind of outliers.
Right. Now,
so I'm sorry, go ahead.
On those liabilities, like I'm just thinking about the cycles of chaos and how that's normalized, or even the conflict avoidance. Some of those might be, well, that's just how we are. That's who we are. That's how we are, right? It's been normalized, as you said. And what is it that people can't see? Like, uh, as we're talking, it's yes, this is things. These are things that are holding the family back. But if it's like, well, you know what, this is just how we communicate. We do try to please everybody. We are acting in that way, and we see that among many family members. How do they know what it would be like if they didn't have that? Like sometimes it just becomes, well, we figured out a way to cope with this, and I think we're doing okay, versus we're thriving because this isn't present. How do we figure that out?
Yeah, well, it usually comes from one family member who's, for example, listening to this podcast, and they're like, maybe it doesn't have to be this way. Or I had experiences in my internship at the different company, and can you believe they didn't act like this? And so usually it's an outlier who starts to come in and change the entire system. And you're exactly right. The reason why I will talk about the book that I'm writing about this a little later, but the reason why I wanted to do this was because of denial and how to move families out of denial. And you're exactly right. It is very difficult, especially exactly what you said, as Seth Godin would say, right? We're not those people, or we're not the family that I'm Sicilian, and Sicilian families pride themselves on being on fighting and
Right.
throwing and hands, and everything's loud, and that also it can also come up when couples get married and your partner is from a different culture, family culture. It's like, this is not going to work.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah. And so, as you mentioned, bringing people into the family can also bring their own stories, their own uh, generational trauma. How do we identify what is a cycle that was through the bloodline, and what was something that was brought in? And as we see different branches of the enterprise, how do we identify those?
Well, you might also be, if we're talking about marrying in, you might also be marrying in out of inherited patterns. Um, and if you're talking about hiring and who you're unconsciously bringing into your family business, again, I'll go back to that inherited unconscious drive, right? You may not even know why you picked that person, but a lot of times it's familiarity with your own family system. But
Right.
to answer the question, how do we do that for good positive things that are helping your legacy, and for negative? I really encourage families, when we do start to do an audit, which is what we'll talk about a little bit later, to just start listing out what are the stories that you know about your family, and just start writing them down. Like, even if it's snippets, I didn't know Uncle Joe very well, but I did know that he had, great big hair, and he sold electronics, like, just
Right.
whatever the stories are that you have heard, start to write them down, positive and negative.
Yes. Awesome. And one thing I wanted to clarify, Rochelle, when you talk about abandonment, I, I just want to clarify that for listeners, in that, abandonment doesn't necessarily need to be, I have my own goals and aspirations. And, as your story, you moved away from West Virginia, you went to Columbia, you pursued your own thing. If you were a member of that family business, is what's the difference between that and, as you talk about, abandonment being a cycle within families?
So abandonment can be emotional abandonment. I work in the family business, but nobody ever listens to me and I'm constantly rejected. Is an abandonment. That's an ongoing, pervasive abandonment. Then there are people who actually abandon the family and they move, 3 countries over and don't want to have anything to do with anybody. There's also what you said about, like, my moving, for example. I abandoned culture, learned a new culture, and that was a positive experience because then I reintegrated my history into what I learned. But
Right.
usually, abandonment in the case of trauma is, it can either happen to us or we can do it to another person, and it causes severe pain.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And Rochelle, bringing back up the concept of your audit, I think that this is a great way. We talked about the positive stories and what those contributors are to the success of the family. As you were mentioning, writing down those stories and thinking about all the history of the family that you can come up with, not just focusing on, here's things that cause me grief or are painful stories. How does that audit go? Like, what would be the way that somebody could really say, yes, this is how I want to engage my brain to come up with all of those stories and memories that I have?
Well, so if we think about words like, so from social work perspective, one of the first things that we are taught is we need to come at things from a strengths perspective. The
Right.
first things that you look at with a client is what are the factors that are already supporting. So in your business, or your family, what are the factors that are already supporting the things that you're very proud of about your parents and your grandparents? And I I love to do, I do long narrative interviews during the audits when I work with families and kind of collect all of that. And then if we really want to get fun with it, then I recommend they go to a documentarian and have them do a documentary on their family, which is amazing and incredibly healing and so good for family businesses. So, they can even use those stories for marketing and for branding. And, if we think about long lasting family brands and the legacies and those little snippets of stories of how they survived difficult times, how did European companies survive World War II? How did wealthy families survive having to move countries and keep their families together? And there are so many good stories like that.
I love that. That's sounds like a lot of fun. Sounds like there could be some great benefit there. And I think that taking that moment to reflect on those stories and say, are these things that are helping or hindering, and not just from a branding perspective, but really going in and saying, all right, what are these, and where do they come from, and how do they support us, and do they support all those members? Because as you mentioned, there could be people who are actually alienated by those stories.
Yes. And Ori, a lot of what I do with individual clients and families is this reframing that we talk about in cognitive behavioral therapy is about changing the perspective on the story. So sometimes there's a story, but you have added your own layer of perspective onto it that is causing ongoing pain in the family. So the idea of marketing and branding, a lot of times therapy is just helping us rebrand ourselves. I don't have to even just, saying that I'm from West Virginia as an example. When I first moved to New York, that was a real culture shock because I didn't get a lot of positive feedback that I was from West Virginia, And so how do I spin this story that I'm not getting respect or positive feedback about, but I'm not ashamed of where I'm from, and I'm not going to change where I'm from, but I do need to change how I'm presenting it.
Yeah, yeah. And Ruschelle, going back to the family that you worked for, that first real dive into the struggles of family wealth, what are some of those catalysts? Like you made mention of sudden wealth, but I'm guessing it's not always sudden wealth that causes some of these events, or makes this change where we see it show up in a way of a mental health issue. How do you see that within families where this wealth is now actually damaging the family and the mental health of the members?
Well, Corey, you are really making an argument for my work just by asking that question, because I'm sure you've heard on a lot of other people in finance talk about that wealth just enhances whatever problems are already there. It enhances the good things about our family, and it will also bring out the very painful things. And that it really brings things to light. And the trick with high net worth families is that they can hide behind their wealth and not have to address those things. And a lot of things can be paid for and covered up and kind of taken care of and hidden from the public. That really what would really be better is if we just started to heal We can have a lot of money and not have good relationships with money. We can have a successful business and have a toxic work environment. Yeah.
And so the hiding behind the wealth and paying to cover things up, uh, how long can that last? It doesn't sound sustainable.
Well, it can be sustainable for a lifetime, Corey, but it doesn't look very good. It doesn't make for a very satisfied life.
Right.
So the answer is, if you have the money to keep, if you have the trust to never have to do anything, and I mean the trust fund, not the actual internal trust,
Yes.
right? If you have the money to keep being bailed out, and a lot of people do, then it can end very, very badly, because where is your bottom? Whereas, in some other circumstances, we might find and be able to hit rock bottom without that. The other thing is this concept, which we know in chronic illness as secondary gains. So, what am I gaining from continuing to be combative in my family? What am I gaining from continuing to be sick? And that doesn't mean somebody wants that necessarily, but it does mean that there's a payoff to be dysfunctional.
Right. And what are some of those habits within families that actually create the payoff for that dysfunction? Like, how would those show up where it's actually a cycle where the family is actually maybe unconsciously promoting that behavior?
Well, I think one of the most common ones, and one that is actually, I just see it being more addressed, it's being addressed a lot these days, is the preparation of next gen earlier and earlier, and parents becoming more aware that they need to include their children in the family business and in the full transparency of what they have, so that they can respect what they have later on. I mean, we're kind of in this time period where generations have said, I'm not telling my kids, they know we're extremely wealthy, but I'm not telling them what they have or what they're going to get. I'm not going to in, really assure that they're financially educated. And then when they're 40 or 50, they're just going to get a bunch of money that I assume they'll know how to deal with. That's what I see the most, in that kind of in the 20 to 30s, and the parents are in their 60s. But the younger parents are not doing that. They're really stepping up and trying to financially educate their children.
Right. And where's that change of narrative coming from?
I would hope partially from the mental health world, partially
Yeah.
that the development of the child, that financial independence and financial knowledge is something that makes for a well-rounded human, no matter what your income level.
Right. And so preparing that next generation, uh, how soon is too soon?
As soon as they can start counting.
Yeah.
And the respect of resources is something that can be taught from the very beginning. Think philosophies like Montessori are really amazing, because they have children doing things and caring for things and cleaning for the house early on. And so this, in the kind of the framework that I work with, the last piece of that is, the third piece is honoring resources. And so we can teach our children to start honoring resources very early on.
Right. And how would that look in actually having them honor those resources? What would be some examples where you could say, you know what, this family has spent the time, has invested in that education and really build some of those foundations? How would that be presented in that rising gem?
So if we're talking about 20 somethings, that looks like, is your adult child capable of holding a job? I mean, that sounds really simple, but I know, I mean, I see families every day whose adult children, for a myriad of different reasons, are not capable of holding a job. So I think that's a big concern for parents, because there are so many benefits of working that don't have anything to do with drawing a paycheck. Maybe you don't need a paycheck, but you do need a schedule and structure and to be able to interact with people.
Right. Absolutely. And Ruschelle, talking, you made the comment about rock bottom. There was a comment that you made, and I want to go back to your story about the time that you were able to focus within to recover from your illness. And you know, it's something outside of your control that put you in that situation, but you had control of the way you handled it. And how can families take that and not necessarily feel like they're at rock bottom before they start? How can they take that?
Yes. So the thing that saved me while had Lyme disease was the fact that I had meditated since I was 12. And the skill that I learned was being the observer of my circumstances. And you don't have to go through a trauma to learn to be the observer of your circumstances. You can practice meditation, you can practice flow states, you can practice mindfulness and approach everything in your life that way and not have to hit rock bottom. And you certainly don't, I would not wish, I would not wish those types of experiences on anybody unless they were incredibly spiritually awakening like mine and just amazing. So, sometimes we go through things and they just suck and that's it.
Right.
But become the observer. And that's what I try to teach families about their interactions. Just observe what's happening and it will change, and it will most likely change for the better.
Right. And so observing, it's a skill. You talked about meditation, flow state. What does that look like? Like, how, thinking of observing, and I'm a fly on the wall of my circumstance here and the situation. What does that look like? Like going to bed at night saying, I now have become the observer. How does somebody say I've done this, or I'm starting, or wow, look at my perception and thought because I did this today?
So the one that meditation allows us to be the observer through body sensation. And so that's one way we can start to pay attention to just the processes of our body in stillness. And that helps us observe other things better. If we want to go intellectually, observing might look like tracking and data. Is there a place in your home life or in your business where you really need to be tracking data? Anything from your sleep to, lead generation, clients coming in. So tracking is one. Also, the use of the arts is another way to become better observers. If we become familiar with music or take up drawing or do something, it usually has to do with the physical body and how we're physically interacting with the world. That makes us a better observer. So those are all kind of outliers to specifically family audits. In a family audit, we're observing your patterns in your family. Yeah.
I love that. And, even that journaling is such a great way to reflect and observe. So I love that. Just writing it down, tracking things is fantastic. Now, Ruschelle, as we near the end of our conversation, there's a few questions that I ask each guest before we wrap up. Are you ready for the tough ones?
I'm ready.
Yes. Now, what is one key strategy that you believe is most essential for building a successful family enterprise?
Well, from my perspective, Corey, it would be family audits and looking at your inherited patterns just to mitigate risk.
Hmm. And tell me more about mitigating risk. What is?
Well, if it's unconscious and you don't know it's happening and it's going to happen, and then there's an outcome from that, where if we talk about executive coaching, everybody always wants to uncover their blind spots, right? So how can you help me see better? How can you gain clarity over this situation or that situation? Well, from a very macro level, family businesses can start to look at their stories and gain a ton of insight into their blind spots.
Fantastic. Now, what is the most common challenge that you see family enterprises encountering when it comes to wealth transition and generational continuity?
Well, we didn't talk about this one today, Corey, and that might be for another podcast. But the big one coming up these days is the grief and loss and the transition challenges with the first generation, the older generation, and kind of stuck points around that. So, what kind of how do we get dad to actually not come to the office anymore and harass the new CEO or that sort of thing? And so what I would say to that is that you need to learn how to speak to denial. You need to learn how to speak to grief and loss of identity. And once you do that and can kind of help that person calm themselves through a huge transition, well, then everything is okay.
Awesome. I love that. I love that talking about loss of identity because it is a real challenge and it shows up in so many ways in the business, in life, in the family. Now, in your experience, what are the top 3 qualities that successful family enterprise leaders possess?
I'm going to give you 4, but I'll be quick about them. So these are the 4 that how I work with families and individuals. So the first is effective communication. The second is compassionate decision making. So are our decisions aligned with our family values? The third is what we talked about earlier, honoring resources, getting companies and families and children to honor them the best that we can. And then the fourth is the openness to receive all the good things that you have coming to you in your life, that you and your family deserve.
Fantastic. I love it. Thank you for the 4. That is great. And before we conclude our discussion, I'd like to highlight where listeners can engage in more of the conversations that you're engaged in. Would you kindly provide us with where guests can find you?
Absolutely. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn all the time. And you can also find me at my website, lifestyleforlegacy.com. And that's where you'll be able to pre-order my book, Inherited Trauma and Family Wealth, a guide to heal relationships and build a lasting legacy.
Amazing. And as you mentioned, Ruschelle, there's so many things we didn't cover, but I wanted to make sure that we covered everything that you thought was relevant to our conversation today. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience that we didn't get a chance to touch on?
I would just reiterate again that my hope for families is that they can really start to see each other more clearly and have deeper and better relationships for a lasting legacy.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Ruschelle. I appreciate you taking the time to share your experiences and expertise with us. Your insights have been incredibly valuable to me, And I'm grateful for your contribution to this episode. And I'm sure our listeners will agree that everything that you've shared has been very valuable to them as well.
Thank you, Corey. It's been a pleasure.
As we wrap up this episode, we invite you to reflect on Ruschelle's insights about inherited patterns, generational trauma, and the intricate connection between wealth and family dynamic. Whether you are a part of a family enterprise or provide consulting to family businesses, Ruschelle's approach offers invaluable tools for fostering healthier relationships and more effective wealth management across generations. Throughout our discussion, we discussed the significant role of inherited pattern in family enterprises. Ruschelle illustrated how addressing these often overlooked influences can enhance both personal development and business performance. We explored practical strategies for improving intergenerational relationships from childhood education to adult succession planning. These insights provide family enterprises with innovative approaches to tackle wealth-related issues, foster emotional well-being, and construct enduring legacies that harmonize personal satisfaction with business objectives. For families looking to strengthen their relationships and navigate the complexities of wealth through a lens of emotional awareness, Ruschelle Khanna offers expert guidance and support. You can connect with Ruschelle through her consulting practice on LinkedIn, and we've included her contact information along with additional strategies and resources in the show notes.